I think elections just generally make us excited. We start thinking about politics, and I don't think it's anything to do with Zelensky. Everybody I speak to respects Zelensky incredibly because he was the president who will go down in history for saying, "I don't need a ride, I need weapons." So we will always remember that. We are here. I'm here speaking to you right now because Zelensky stood up for the whole of Ukraine and didn't run away.
Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It's nice to see all of you. Once again, we have a global audience from North Carolina and from across the United States and indeed from abroad, such as the UK and Northern Ireland, Germany, Slovenia, Australia, Switzerland, and some other countries. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill. I've run the Krasno Global Affairs series since 2012, and we want to bring some much needed sober thinking and analysis to global affairs. We want to avoid the overly emotional and polarized debate which has become all too common today. We are non-partisan, of course. Today we have two wonderful guests, two distinguished lawyers, both based in London. They are Lord Charlie Benner, KC, and Lady Tetyana Nesterchuk. Thank you, Tetyana, for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to address your audience.
Of course. And thank you, Charlie, for being our guest today. How are you today?
Very well, thank you, Klaus. It's a pleasure to see you. And again, thank you from me for the great privilege and honor of being part of this program.
You're more than welcome. Today we will look at Russia's frozen assets, the Ukraine war, and we will also consider Russia's role in the Iran war. Among many other things, we will talk about whether or not the EU and other European countries and the UK should release Russia's frozen sovereign assets for supporting Ukraine's war efforts and Ukrainian reconstruction. I would like to encourage our audience to submit questions via the chat function of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants today, Dovil and Andrew, will select them and read them out to all of us. After our initial conversation, our two distinguished guests will be more than happy to answer your many questions. Let me introduce Lord Benner to you briefly. Charlie Benner, KC, was called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2004 and to the Bar of Northern Ireland in 2010. He was appointed Queen's Counsel in 2019 at the early age of 38. Charlie practices as a barrister from Keating Chambers in London. His experience includes 19 appeals in the UK Supreme Court and 13 cases in the EU courts. He also has significant judicial experience, having sat part-time as a justice of the Astana International Finance Center Court in Kazakhstan, and thereafter, after 2025, in the judicial grave in Jersey in the Channel Islands. Since 2024, Charlie Benner has been a working peer in the House of Lords, in which capacity he sits as a legislator in the upper house of the UK Parliament. He regularly writes and speaks about defense and foreign policy issues. Charlie, his wife Tetyana, and I met at the Sarajevo Security Conference last year and only recently also at the Munich Security Conference. Fortunate for us, they readily agreed to join the Krasno Global Event Series. Let me also introduce Lady Tetyana Nesterchuk to you. Tetyana is a barrister and arbitrator at Fountain Court Chambers in London. Tetyana Nesterchuk came to the UK in 1999 as the first Ukrainian to study as an undergraduate on a scholarship at Oxford University. Since then, she has worked as a lecturer in jurisprudence at Oxford University, as a solicitor at Slaughter and May, specializing in corporate transactions. She has also worked as a judicial assistant at the UK Supreme Court and also as a barrister and arbitrator at Fountain Court Chambers in London. Tetyana is internally displaced in Ukraine, having helped her family flee their home in Donetsk. She's a native Ukrainian and Russian speaker and has two children. At Fountain Court Chambers, Tetyana Nesterchuk acts as counsel and arbitrator in complex international commercial disputes in a variety of sectors, including banking, natural resources, energy, pharmaceuticals, and education, and also she deals with the effects of sanctions on arbitration. Tetyana is consistently recognized for her highly innovative work. She is a contributor to many articles on LexisNexis arbitration and Westlaw UK. Thank you both for finding the time to join us today. You both have very busy schedules, as we just heard. Therefore, thanks for joining us today. Let me ask you straight away about the current situation. The Iran war seems to have sidelined the Ukraine war in the media. But what is the situation on the ground in Ukraine right now, as far as you can tell? Will the Ukraine war be over soon? Lord Banner, would you address that?
Yes, Tatyana's probably better placed as somebody who's got family, direct family on the ground now. Will it? I don't think it will be resolved soon. And the reason I say that is that any imposed or enforced settlement that the American administration may seek to encourage and or cajole Ukraine into agreeing, if it involves the giving up of land in eastern Ukraine and or Crimea. I don't think the Ukrainian people will accept that. And it will, in reality, I think there will end up being a form of guerrilla warfare. It will continue, just as happens. There's examples of that in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, examples in Palestine, of course, as well. So I don't think it's practical. I don't think it's politically tenable for Ukraine to effectively agree to a what would be a surrender deal. I don't see that President Zelensky or indeed anybody else who might likely be president after him could tenably agree to that. People would say, well, what's the point of why have we been fighting all this time? And also, it's very dangerous for Ukraine because if there were to be a deal along the lines that's been suggested, it would allow Putin and the Russians to regroup, rearm, and they would then have a clear run on Kiev. If one looks at the strategic, because it's very flat land, they have a very clear run on Kiev, and they'd be able to take Kiev in a 1 to 2 years' time sufficiently quickly that the West wouldn't have time to respond. So I don't see how Ukraine can agree to ceding land in the way that's envisaged. And I say, even if they do, I think you'll get guerrilla warfare anyway. And equally, I can't see how Russia, President Putin, could agree to terms that would involve it relinquishing its claim to the land that it's taken. Or indeed to other strategic land that it hasn't yet taken, but it wants to have. So essentially, there's a stalemate. And I don't see in reality any real way out of it. It may also be that the world's attention has moved on from that to Iran, and obviously
that would be my next question. Are you worried
exactly.
about the Iran war distracting attention from Ukraine, that the United States is perhaps giving up on Ukraine and focusing on Iran? Is that a genuine worry?
I think what I would say is I think that what happened on October the 7th in Israel a couple of years ago, I think there's a high probability, obviously I haven't had access to any intelligence on this, but a high probability that that the fact that that ended up distracting the world from Ukraine was no coincidence. I mean, it's no secret that Iran and Russia are bedfellows. The Shahed drones that rained down in Iran, rained down in Ukraine, are Iranian designs. Shahed is not a very well-known Russian name. Then there's a reason for that. And Iran are known to have funded Hamas historically. And it seems to me to be a reasonable inference, albeit I haven't seen the information, that Iran facilitated October the 7th at Putin's bequest in order to distract the world. I think that's entirely plausible. So that's certainly the case. Whether it's now distracting the world from Ukraine is a different matter. But I'll pass to Tetyana because she's the one who's got family boots on the ground who really knows what's
Exactly.
going on.
Tetyana, how do you see the situation in Ukraine?
So I I can say the following for sure. The peace treaty, any peace agreement that's been made without Ukraine isn't going to hold. And as our president said, whatever peace treaty he's forced to accept, and we might well be forced to accept something because we are reliant on US support. Absolutely, we're reliant on military support, we're reliant on intelligence support from US. If he is forced to accept any sort of peace treaty, he will have to go to his people for a referendum. And right now, I think the mood of the population is such that Charlie's right, we will not give up our lands. But of course, what Russia is requesting, its minimum requests are that we give up not just the land which Russia holds militarily, but also parts of the lands which are held by Ukraine, and where all of our fortifications are placed, which have been sort of built over the last 4 years. I can't imagine Ukrainian people ever voting to give up their own people to Russia. We know, Charlie talks about guerrilla warfare. Unfortunately, we know exactly what Russian occupation is like. We have experienced it for over 10 years now. And in the past, we had about 70 years of Russian occupation. After the Second World War, any Ukrainian, after the First World War, Ukrainian resistance has been completely quelled down with a huge amount of force. Right now, we have evidence and stories from people in occupation who are being arrested, tortured, and killed for as little as possessing books in Ukrainian, trying to teach their children Ukrainian language, even carrying flowers which are blue and yellow. That is an offense for which a friend of mine was arrested and put in prison for. She's a mother. So these, any kind of civilian resistance will not happen, I think, because of just the way Russia will do. But what we will see is complete disappearance and genocide of any Ukrainian population. And we have heard that from the Russian authorities. So I think that's where we are. We are between surviving and no longer existing. We either give up our people, not just our territory, but this is not about land, I'm afraid to say, this is about our people. We either give up our people who are still trying to fight on the other side, or we continue fighting for them. So it may well end up in some sort of frozen conflict, who knows. But I have, right now, I came back from Ukraine in January, at the end of February, at the end of last month, and the mood is quietly hopeful, despite everything. And I think that's because we've just finished. We've lived through the worst winter of the last 20 years, perhaps. And if we manage to survive that, I think the feeling is we'll survive anything. So frozen conflict, I'm not sure that's necessarily something that will happen. I think in this situation, one of the countries will fall, and it's not necessarily Ukraine, because this is a conflict that's been going on for a long, long time. So it's a question of funding. And I think that's why we're talking about assets.
Let me push you a bit. I mean, we know about the heroic resistance, particularly during this cold winter, of many people in Ukrainian towns and cities that was reported widely. But on the other hand, also millions of Ukrainians have left the country, and also there is a scarcity of recruits who want to join the army. There is clearly a lack of soldiers. And so doesn't that indicate that the will of resistance, that the stamina of the Ukrainian people is gradually eroding because of the long time the war has been going on?
Look, we are losing our people. I don't think our will is eroding, but I think the numbers are. There's no doubt about it. We have a lot of young men who've been maimed. We have terrible statistics. 1 in 5 children have lost one of both parents during this war. Huge numbers of young men and women have lost limbs, and now can no longer fight. I have friends who've lost limbs, have recovered, are now wearing prosthetic and want to go back to the front line. So there are still people, trust me, who want to fight, and I know them personally. There are issues they have to overcome. A lot of them have to overcome emotional and physical, psychological and physical issues. But we certainly are not giving up. But realistically, yes, we now see a lot more women on the front line, whereas before that was pretty much the exception. But we also have to remember this war is no longer fought just on the front line. Ukrainians have shown the world what they can do about drones. As I understand it, some Ukrainian military specialists are actually deployed in the Middle East to provide the expertise and interception of the Shahid drones. So we have taught the world that the war is not just fought with bodies on the front line, but also with our minds and drones, etc. So I think we're using the technology to our advantage right now.
Just to follow that up, I think that's absolutely right. One drone is worth arguably, several pairs of boots on the ground. And the technology is improving hugely fast. I mean, the British Defence Minister Al Carnes, who knows a thing or two about this subject as a former brigadier in the Special Forces, he was on the record there saying, the rate of the pace of change in relation to drone technology is such now that if the UK was to place an order for a large, number of them, by the time the order was ready, the drones would be obsolete. That's so fast. So I think that is a huge advantage. I think there's another point if we're looking forward, Klaus, as well. I think the other thing that guides my thinking of where what the future may hold is realpolitik as it's known, because I don't think it is geopolitically acceptable for Europe to let Kiev fall. Eastern Ukraine is sort of in the hearts and minds of a lot of politicians and people in Europe. In reality, is perhaps seen as less close to home. There's the fake narrative that it always was part of Russia. It looks architecturally, it looks in places more like Russia. Now that's wrong, but that's a sense that you get in the minds of some politicians. Whereas I think if Kiev fell after everything that everyone's said and done about Ukraine, we stand with Ukraine, etc., etc. If Kiev fell, I think that would be a totemic rejection of European power and democracy. And I don't see how France, Germany in particular, and indeed the UK, could let that happen. And it will happen without the money eventually. It will happen. It's bound to eventually without the money, which goes back to the sanctions. So I think eventually Europe will belatedly dig in a way that it hasn't yet, both on the sanctions and potentially in relation to, if necessary, further military reinforcements.
Yeah, I'm sure you're quite right. But before we come to the money and to the frozen assets, let me just ask perhaps Tetyana, what about the position of President Zelensky? Sometimes we read he is very much still supported very strongly, and then we hear that he is not as strongly supported. There was a recent corruption scandal. He announced general elections sometime soon, so we don't quite know when. So how is the Ukrainian position dealing with the political landscape within Ukraine?
I'm glad you asked me that question. Again, I just came back from Kiev, and one thing I will tell you is that politics is everywhere. Everyone's thinking about elections, including everybody on the front line. So I've met with a colleague of mine who serves in the front line, and he's been telling me about everything that's been going on. And I think the mood, including, I saw a question from someone saying, do you think the tide is turning? I'm not sure whether the tide is turning or not. I'm not the one to comment on it, but I definitely think that the mood, including on the front line, is just positive right now, whether it's because the winter is over or for any other reason. But elections are something we're actually looking forward to. We're a very political nation. We are very democratic. We have sort of gone to the streets to force a change of regime in the past, and that's partly why Donetsk became occupied, because after the revolution on the Maidan. So I think elections just generally make us excited. We start thinking about politics, and I don't think it's anything to do with Zelensky. Everybody I speak to respects Zelensky incredibly, because he was the president who will go down in history for saying, I don't need a ride, I need weapons. So we will always remember that. We are here. I'm here speaking to you right now because Zelensky stood up for the whole of Ukraine and didn't run away the way Yanukovych did, our previous president. So everybody will remember him for that. But I think we're ready for change, for sure. And I think the general feeling in in Ukraine is that 5 years, or it's been longer. It's far too long for somebody to effectively be in charge, and so time for change, and people are quite excited about change. And
In Europe, in America, when you look around, there's a great deal of frustration with the incumbent politicians for many reasons, including bad economies and various scandals. And in Ukraine, we also have heard about scandals and corruption. Is that sapping the enthusiasm for the people of Ukraine to be interested in politics, to go and vote, or doesn't that have had any effect?
No, it does have the effect, but it has the opposite effect. It makes people want to go into politics, to want to go and vote, to use their votes to speak, and to say, we are not going to stand up or stand aside and watch corruption. We have fought, we have lost our lives for the last 4 years so that we don't live in a corrupt state. So if it's going to be just a continuation of what happened before, then no, thank you very much. So I think it encourages people to think about politics, and we will see a lot of exciting new politicians in Ukraine for sure, because a lot of those boys from the front line, a lot of men from the front line, people of my age and older, who have the experience, are now thinking very seriously about going into politics, local politics, big state politics, and changing things. And I think that's very exciting for me, because we have not had this sort of global move towards change before now.
Thank you very much. Charlie, in a recent speech in the House of Lords, you mentioned that there is something like a missile gap and perhaps a financial gap because of the change policy of the United States toward Ukraine. So that brings us back to the money, and that Europe really needs to have a lot of money to finance the Ukraine war effort, the reconstruction effort. Where is that money coming from? And are you kind of pessimistic about the role of the United States regarding Ukraine going forward?
So at the moment, the money is coming. Well, the interest on the state assets has been made available to Ukraine via a sort of loan, the ERA loan system, but the principal, obviously, at the moment is held up. I mean, a lot of the investment that's being made at the moment by Europe is coming from the taxpayers. It's coming from Tetyana and me and our fellow countrymen and people working in the UK and in the EU, um,
and the US.
and the US. And I think increasingly the narrative certainly ought to be, and I think it will do as people feel the squeeze and Ukraine feels the squeeze. The narrative should be that it shouldn't be the Western democratic taxpayers who are footing the bill to combat Russia's illegal invasion. It should be Russia who are footing the bill to combat their illegal invasion. And I think that's hugely important to get the message across. And I think there's also the courage that's needed, the political courage and conviction to take the necessary decisions in relation to the principle of the state assets, but also to the extent that's necessary to top it up with taxpayers' money. Is that we've got skin in the game. This isn't some distant war that doesn't affect us. I mean, obviously, on a macro geopolitical level, it affects us because if Russia is seen to get away with largely illegally seizing land that doesn't belong to it, then that sends a terrifying precedent that, in my view, makes a Third World War more likely, if it hasn't already started, rather than less likely, because others will see that they can do similar things and get away with it. China will take the message in relation to Taiwan, for example. Russia will probe elsewhere, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, etc. So there's the precedent effect. And there's also the fact that I was very reliably informed about 15 months ago, just before the winter before last, so the winter 2024, 2025, that if Kiev fell, there could be something like 19 million refugees coming from Ukraine to Europe. And, I don't know to what extent in America the plight of the small boats is on your radar that you hear. Certainly, it's a very big political issue here in the UK. And that will look like a literal drop in the ocean compared to the millions, tens of millions of Ukrainian refugees that will flee in the event that Russia were to take Kiev or diminish it to the point that it was no longer a functioning city. And can you imagine the cost of that? To Europe, the cost of maintaining, processing, the political cost of a refugee crisis. It's arguable that the refugee crisis, the small boats, brought down the last government. Well, imagine that on steroids. So I think there's economic self-interest actually, and political self-interest ought to lead um, certainly the European leaders, and I would hope America too, to realise actually that backing the repurposing the state assets, but also investing their own money in defending Ukraine and enabling Ukraine to defend itself is money well spent.
Thank you. There is roughly $300 billion of Russia's frozen assets available in Belgium and other European countries, including something like 25 to 30 billion in the UK. You are an eminent lawyer. This is Russia's possession. That is Russia's money. Is it legal under international law? I'm not now talking about the emotional dimension of that. And I think here we are all in agreement. But is it legal under international law to simply take that Russian money and give it to Ukraine? And how would one make it legal? And you are the one to explain that to us, I believe.
I'm happy to step in, and thank you for asking. Now, just a correction, there's about 300 billion worldwide, including in the US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, about 200 billion, maybe slightly more in Europe. The legalities. Okay, we have two situations here. The first situation, legal situation, is that Russia is in breach of a number of international agreements, including the most important under the UN treaty, which is that you do not start a war of aggression against another sovereign state. So it's in breach. There's also kind of an international agreement that Russia has caused huge amounts of losses to Ukraine. The World Bank estimated losses, the last estimate is 580 billion. So there's that too. There is a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights against Russia, finding it responsible for all the damage caused to Ukraine whilst Russia was a member of the European Convention on Human Rights. They haven't calculated the amounts, but I'm told that it will exceed 300 billion. And that's going back to 2014, the invasion in 2014, and up to September 2022. So it doesn't account for the last 4 years of the war. There is a recognition by the UN General Assembly and its General Assembly rather than Security Council, because Russia has the right of veto. So General Assembly recognized that Russia will have to pay reparations to Ukraine. So we have all those obligations. There's a basic obligation, which is that he who causes the damage must pay for it. We are all owners of our money, property, etc. But if you cause damage to someone else, that property will be taken away if need be. If you're not going to do it voluntarily, it will be done by the courts, it will be done by the police, court officers. They will take it away and they will give it to someone else, the person who is your victim. So we're here in exactly the same situation, but on an international scale. So not private relations, international relations between different states. And international law, unsurprisingly, also has a mechanism which allows you to force the aggressor to pay to its victim, even where aggressor is refusing to pay. And that's called the law of countermeasures. It's been implemented and set out by the International Law Commission in its articles on the international responsibilities of states. So we have the International Law of Countermeasures, which permits, in fact, doesn't just permit, it imposes a duty on different states to enforce international obligations of other states. So here we have the European Union, the US, the UK, Japan, who have a duty under international law to ensure not only that Russia stops the war, but also that it pays reparations to Ukraine. And it is under that principle that it is absolutely legal. In fact, there can be no other way of ensuring that Russia pays, but keeping back the frozen assets.
Okay,
And
let me interrupt you there. If it was that clear, and it sounds very clear what you say, but if it was that clear, why are the Belgians concerned? Why did it fail in December, last December, within the European Union to bring that suggestion of basically taking the frozen assets and making them all available to Ukraine? Why did that all fail?
The Belgians' concerns are very different from concerns about the legality of it. I can assure you of that. Now, politics gets involved. What were the Belgians concerned about? Their first concern was for their own safety and security. Russia threatened Belgium. And we know this because the president Bart de Wever said that he was personally threatened. He was told that, Belgium will suffer if they hand over the assets. So that's number one. The head of Euroclear was physically threatened by Russia. That has also come out in the press. So there was a lot of things going on. Belgium was threatened physically by various drones, not just Belgium. In fact, a lot of European countries bordering Russia were threatened by a lot of drones hanging out at their airports, closing down flights, etc. So Belgium's concern is not necessarily legal. And I would say not legal at all. It was for safety. It was also political. Belgium didn't want to be seen as the state that relinquished the Russian assets. They've done all they could to protect themselves. So I think that's part of it. There is, in fact, now a legal case that the central bank brought against the European Council. And I think another reason is actually political reticence. The thing is, these assets should have been seized a long time ago. It should have been made very clear after the UNGA resolution, which said that Russia owes reparations to Ukraine. It should have been made very clear that these assets will go towards satisfying Russia's debt to Ukraine. So there's absolutely no dispute whatsoever that the title to those assets no longer belongs to Russia. The title passes to Ukraine. What Russia gets is the repayment of its debt. Well, part of its debt, because we know its debt is going to be much more than 200 billion that we've got here in Europe. So that's what should have happened. It didn't. And I think that's part of the reason why people are now terrified. Russia, or rather the Central Bank of Russia, whose assets are frozen, have made an application to the European Court of Justice in the European Union. I haven't seen the application. I've just seen that the case has been issued about a week ago or so, effectively arguing about the freeze of these assets. Now, the principle used to freeze these assets is exactly the same as a principle which authorizes the confiscation of those assets. It's a principle of countermeasures. And so maybe we will get a judgment from the European Court about the legality of the principle of countermeasures, and that might actually help us.
Thank you. Thank you. Charlie, why did the European Union not proceed in December of last year with permanently seizing the Russian assets? At the moment, just to clarify that a little, they are frozen. They cannot be used. The principle cannot be used, but the interest of on that principle, which is quite a lot of money, is legally okay to use that, but not the actual principle. And the decision in December was really postponed that the principle could be used and be given to Ukraine. So why didn't that happen?
I'm a little less kind than Tetyana is to the Belgians. I would say it's a combination of ineffective leadership, political cowardice, inertia, and corporate greed. But I say I perhaps am able to not mince my words, and because I speak from a sort of political perspective on this. And the reason I say that, it was largely the Belgians, to be honest, who were behind this. Interestingly, Euroclear, the Belgium, is 7% owned by China, which I think is a really interesting metric on this. There's a concern about, as you've heard, a concern about the precedent it might set for other investors from other states and other parts of the world. To my mind, the only precedent it sets is don't illegally seize somebody else's country and we won't take your money. It's not a particularly bad precedent to set when you look at it that way. So I think there's an element of that. I think there is a degree of cowardice is a strong word, but people have been intimidated by Russia and people are scared about what will happen. But it's the very important lesson of history is Russia can smell out weakness and it respects strength. There's a really interesting, fantastic book, one of the best books I've read recently, by Max Hastings, called Abyss, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Absolutely thoroughly recommend it to you and all of those on this call. And that makes clear that essentially the reason why the Russians, the Soviets blinked first during that crisis was because J.F. Clay held a firm line, and the Russians were made very clear that in the event of a nuclear exchange at that moment in time, Russia would be annihilated. America would actually still survive in small fragments. They respect strength, and so allowing their intimidation to work, unfortunately, only makes them go further and go harder. And I think when I say ineffective leadership in inertia, until the problem really comes home, until it's clear that without this money, Ukraine might fall, Kiev might fall. It's easier to kick the can down the road when otherwise there's safety concerns, there's the intimidation, there's the concerns about other investors. It's easier just to kick the can down the road rather than take proactive, principled leadership on this issue. And unfortunately, that's what's happened. I think eventually, when it does become clear that this money is essential, suddenly action will be taken. As Tetyana's outlined, there is a legal basis for it. I mean, ultimately, if you owe me $10 and I find $5 of yours on the floor, I can keep it because and that's essentially the principle. So I'm afraid to say, I'm not especially charitable. Perhaps the reason I don't mince my words is I've asked about this several times in the House of Lords. I asked the government, I get the same cookie cutter response, which is we all have to act together. It's very difficult and it has to be lawful. And the duration that those cookie cutter answers have now been trolled out by a succession of ministers, it's about as long a period of time as it took the Americans to invent a nuclear weapon, about a long period of time as the Manhattan Project, longer time than it took to invent a vaccine for COVID. So yeah, it might be difficult, but those two things were pretty difficult too. When humanity wants to, when it needs to, it comes up with solutions to difficult problems. So it's not the difficulty, it's not the legality. Unfortunately, it's the will that isn't quite there yet.
Thank you. Can I remind our viewers that to submit their questions by writing into the chat function at the Zoom screen? We will turn to you in a minute. Just a question again to Charlie. In the UK, there are 25 billion pounds in Russia's frozen assets, so to speak. Is the UK about to release that money on a permanent basis, or what is the situation in the UK compared to the situation in the EU?
That's probably for you.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. Look,
Okay.
there isn't 25 billion in the UK. So overall, there's 25 billion, but of that, more than half, about 13 billion, maybe even 15 billion, is money that's frozen that belongs to private individuals. And we're not talking about the seizure of those funds, because it'll be quite difficult to show that the private individuals are in fact responsible for Russia waging its war of aggression. It is much easier to say that the Central Bank of Russia, which sponsors and funds Russia's military campaign against Ukraine, is responsible. So in terms of state assets, Central Bank of Russia assets, and National Wealth Fund of Russia assets, there's only, as I understand it, about 8 billion. What is UK doing about it? I'm afraid to say absolutely nothing. They are sitting and waiting to see what Europe is going to decide, and I think it'll be quite difficult to persuade them to do anything else. You in the US are actually much further than we are in the UK on that issue, because you have the law that allows the president to seize those assets and transfer them to a fund that belongs to Ukraine, some sort of compensation fund. But here in the UK, we haven't even got the law. I proposed the law back in February of 2023, during the very first year of the war, before the end of the first year of the war. That bill didn't even get to a second reading. It was slowly killed in Parliament. And I'm still waiting. We now have a very different government, and I'm still waiting for the government to proceed on this issue. But I don't think they will, because sadly, they're just waiting for someone else to move first.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on a little bit to American policy towards Ukraine, which has changed recently. Are you disappointed by what has come out of the Trump administration, or do you believe we get the wrong side of the stick, that the policy is still much more commitment to Ukraine than is perhaps generally portrayed?
Very difficult question. Um, it's a very difficult question because um, President Trump's modus operandi, and I don't necessarily mean this as a criticism at all. I'm sure he would say this himself, is not to be predictable.
Hmm.
You know, he very, very hard. These are normally, it's normally you can predict how many humans will behave because by the time they get to a position like that, they've got a form, they've got a track record. Trump is very hard to predict, so it's quite hard to rationalize, what's likely to come next in relation to Ukraine. Um,
Yes, but let's put it more clearly. Uh,
mm,
the Biden administration was more strongly behind Ukraine, gave more military aid, more financial aid than the Trump administration. And are you worried about that? And do you think that will continue, that will even get worse, or is it going to change again? What
Can
is
I
the
can
expectation?
I
yeah.
jump in? Can I jump in on this?
Absolutely.
I disagree with the premise of that question. I think the Biden administration has a lot to answer for. They gave us some weapons very late, but they gave those weapons on conditions on which we couldn't even fight. So we had some weapons, but the condition was that we couldn't possibly shoot into the Russian territory. So we have to fight the war, and weapons came in very small doses and much later than we needed them. So I think the Biden administration was actually incredibly worried about Ukraine winning this war against Russia. So they were very worried to make sure that they gave us enough weapons to make sure that we didn't completely fail and stopped existing, but certainly not enough for us to win. President Trump is very different. He doesn't think about sort of politics in that way. What he thinks about are probably the interests of sort of his businesses and US businesses generally. I mean, that's his interest. So I think whoever offers him the best financial deal will get the best support that they can get. And in that sense, it's almost easier to negotiate with somebody like that because you understand what their motivations are. They're effectively economic interests of America. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. So
Mm.
I don't want to say much more because he is the president of the US, and we are absolutely reliant on his goodwill and support for our own survival. So whatever we get, we're grateful for. And also, what he has done is he ensured that Europe actually wakes up and starts thinking
Absolutely.
about this war as European war rather
But
than
isn't it,
a war
isn't
that
it the
US should be.
but isn't it the case that the US sells its arms and missiles to Europe, and then the Europeans gives them for free to the Ukrainians?
Yeah, he looks after his business
Mm.
interests.
Yes. I mean, I think what Tatiana said about giving Europe a wake-up call is very important. And it may well be the most important global potential. I mean, obviously, but obviously global geopolitics is a moving feast literally right now. But it may well end up being one of the most important legacy of the second Trump presidency globally. Because I don't know, some people who think he was wrong to effectively say, Europe's got to pay for managing its own doorstep itself. Some people think it's wrong, some people think it's right. I don't want to get into that debate. I'm more interested in the consequence, and the consequence of that has been a huge wake-up call to the European countries who basically have been um, um, relying upon America and American protection, American money, American defense for a very long period of time. And suddenly, when now that reliance doesn't look quite so secure, we suddenly realize, hang on a minute. For example, the UK's nuclear submarine base doesn't have any air defenses at all, which is extraordinary, for example. And so all the talk about, oh, well, we might increase our defense spending to 5% of GDP in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, we're now realizing we should be doing this yesterday. and all the European countries are talking about that. And I think that is a very important thing for all of us to be doing. And so I do think that is a beneficial consequence of the Trump administration's policy, irrespective of whether one agrees or disagrees with that policy.
No, I think you're right, and I think even most Europeans would agree with that and say
Mm.
that is what Trump has to be given credit for. But when we talk about Ukraine and the Ukraine war, isn't there the general concern that Trump is much too close to Putin? Think of the Alaska visit, think of the various phone calls they have, and then the decision which seems to be based on what Putin whispered into his ear, while the Europeans seem to have a much more straightforward pro-Ukraine position than the United States seems to have at that moment in time.
I mean, it's certainly, and I'll speak because it's perhaps easier for a Brit to comment on that than a Ukrainian for what I hope for obvious reasons. Yeah, I think the optic was obviously unfortunate, um, but again, President Trump does things differently, and we all know that, whether we agree or disagree with um, his political views and policies. And ultimately, even though his treatment of Zelensky in the White House was not something I certainly would have done, his red carpeting of Putin in Alaska was not something I would have done, for example. Um, Ultimately, as things stand as of today, Ukraine is still in the fight. They got through winter. And
But
um,
wasn't that due more to the Europeans than to the US?
Well, or as it was, is it
Including
part
the
of his?
UK.
Yeah, is it part of the Trump's approach of stepping back has galvanized Europe and galvanized the UK, and perhaps in a way that they weren't before. So, and I'm not seeking to defend. I mean, I deliberately don't want to defend or criticize because there'll be a range of different views here. I'm seeking to sort of analyze really cause and effect, and as I say, it's certainly been unconventional the way he's um, conducted some of the discussions on this. Um, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the proof of the pudding right now is Ukraine are still in this fight, and Russia are still sending a lot of young men to the meat grinder.
Mhm. How do you see that, Tetyana?
How do I see President Trump's policies in Ukraine? I mean,
Also his closeness to Russia. Doesn't that concern you as a Ukrainian?
as a Ukrainian, look, on the one hand, yes, it concerns me. On the other, it might be helpful in this situation because I think we all know that the conflict will not be resolved on the front line. You know, we are not going to resolve it militarily. It's going to end in one of two ways, I believe. It's either going to end because Russia collapses from within, whether economically or politically, uh, or it's going to end because there's some sort of peace treaty, some sort of and will exist. In fact, it will not end. It will just exist as a frozen conflict forever and ever, and we will always have to live with the threat of another war on in Europe developing very quickly. So I think it's helpful to have somebody who understands Putin, and I think that's what Trump believes. Trump believes he understands Putin. And I think that is very helpful. It would be helpful if Trump also liked our president. He unfortunately personally does not like Zelensky, and again, that's why maybe elections will help, because I think what hasn't helped Ukraine is this kind of very personal, and you can see it from the interviews that we see on screen, very personal animosity for some reason by Trump towards Zelensky, even though Zelensky has a lot of admirable qualities. So maybe a different president would suit us better when it comes to dealing with President Trump, I think.
Right, thank you very much. Let's turn to some questions. We have plenty of questions here. Dovil, can I ask you to ask the first question? And please, if you know the name and the location of the questioner, please mention that too.
Yes, Stuart from DC would like to know whether the most likely outcome of the war in Ukraine could be a frozen conflict, similarly to the situation on the Korean Peninsula following the Korean War.
I mean, I think we've covered that already, to be honest. I mean, I think it is one of the scenarios for sure, but I very much hope it's not the only scenario. And I think by putting economic pressure, by continuing to put economic pressure on Russia, I think there is also another very likely scenario, which is that Russia will collapse economically.
Why do you think so?
Why do I think so? Well, they've been living on borrowed funds for a really long time. They've been funding their military campaign by borrowing money from their banks, money that their banks don't actually have. So they've been effectively putting their hands in the pockets of their own taxpayers in order to fund this.
But
They've
now
been
the oil price is exploding and Russia.
now I guess it yes. Now I think we are in trouble. But we need to start hope. Well. I would say we should just start relying less on oil, more on renewable energy, and try to survive without Russian oil and continue the sanctions. So I would argue let's continue the sanctions because in the long run, I think it'll be cheaper because Russia is a big threat to Europe.
Thank you. Can we have another question, Andrew?
Yes. So one anonymous viewer asks, do you think European powers would actually put boots on the ground and or send significantly more funds to Ukraine in the future without American support?
That's a question for Charlie.
Yeah, I think they could do it in some scenarios. Will they necessarily do? I don't think it's inevitable. It'll go to what's in it for them. I mean, there's a lot of talk of the coalition of the winning holding the peace if there is to be a peace, um, and that's one permutation. Although it's been talked up a lot more than I think actually the reality of that proposal. Would they send boots on the ground into Ukraine prior to a peace? Well, I mean, I think it's no secret that there are special forces already there, for some way, shape, or form. I don't think they would send an army there.
I really don't think so. And I mean, I've spoken to a lot of people, and really, we have a million-strong army in Ukraine. Despite what you hear, despite the fact that, people are saying, oh, you haven't got enough people, we have a million-strong army. There isn't that, just the number of women in our army is 5 times the size of the Estonian army. So, look, we really don't need European boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Tell us about the special forces, Charlie.
I don't. Well, there's a news report of one special forces personnel, I think, who died in Ukraine a few months ago in a factory. So there was a news report. I think it's no secret that there are people, but then it's no secret that the special forces do what they do all around the world, 365 days a year.
And you think other countries, other European countries are, also have their own special forces on the ground in Ukraine?
I'd be surprised if they didn't.
Me too. Dovil, can we have another question?
Yes, Charlie from National Defense University has a direct question to Lord Banner. You've earlier suggested that Russia may have an interest in having other conflicts draw attention from its war in Ukraine. Is Russia's reaction to the Iran-Israel conflict and its diplomatic positioning better understood as a revolution and how great powers think about geopolitical conflict, or simply an evolution of long-standing strategic behavior?
I think it probably is an evolution of current behavior. I mean, I think what's the most interesting thing about Russia's stance in relation to the Iran conflict is, for all it might have commented on it, it's not actually really done anything to help Iran. I mean, what kind of an ally is that? I would encourage, Western leaders to highlight that. I mean, we have the NATO treaty, which I still believe it. Attack on one is attack on all. When Russia's allies, one of its closest allies, gets hit, what does it do? Say some things, maybe provide a little bit of equipment, but doesn't stand side by side. It's not a very trustworthy friend. I think that's the most important and telling message from Russia's stance.
Well, that is what Trump complained about it with the current British Prime Minister.
Yes.
That he wasn't prepared to help out, and then he changed his mind.
Yes.
And how do you see that yourself? And what is the current position? The UK is involved in defense action, I believe. What does it mean?
Good question. You have to ask the Prime Minister. Yes, this defensive. I think the Prime Minister made a mistake. A lot of people think the Prime Minister made this mistake. I've no doubt he means well, but there is a particular cohort close to the Prime Minister who have a very particular way of looking at things legally. And it's a perfectly respectable way, but it's not the only way. And yet the Prime Minister's judgment calls are defined by that particular way of looking at international law. So I think he made a mistake. I think he probably realizes he's made a mistake, and he's certainly been told that he's made a mistake by President Trump. And Tony Blair has even been on the record saying that.
Wasn't he haunted by the Iraq War and Tony Blair and Tony
Yes.
Blair's unpopularity in the UK still?
Haunted, yes, although I think it's more doctrinal than that. I mean, Keir Starmer was a what we would call a claimant lawyer. You know, he would act in group litigation by protest, for example, by people the families of people who've been killed by British soldiers in Iraq. He would act for protesters at RAF air bases who protested against. That's how he made his living, relying on the human rights legislation to act for people who opposed the Iraq War, who claimed to be victims of the Iraq War, etc. That's how he really made his notoriety and fame. And so I think it's not quite as much as a political being haunted by the Iraq War as he's ultimately, I suspect, a pacifist.
Right. Tell us briefly about the current position. So UK forces are involved in the war in Iran in a defensive posture. What does it mean, and how much involved are UK forces?
So, at least officially, there is some involvement, principally at the moment out of our base in Cyprus, although there's talk of a ship being sent over as well. And we are also allowing the use of our air bases by American jets in what have been described as defensive operations. And I think the way it's been, the pinhead on which the Prime Minister has danced is to say that the initial strikes were not lawful, and therefore it was not in accordance with international law for the UK to provide assistance in those initial strikes. But once Iran struck back at not just Israel, but also the various other countries in the Gulf, and even Turkey, and even our embassy at Cyprus, then engagement was allowed under international law. And so that is what they are doing. There has been some amusement, to be quite honest, in this country, and indeed I think especially also in Ukraine. The Ministry of Defence in the UK is now, perhaps in an attempt to portray us as being very actively involved, has posted on no fewer than 3 occasions that a drone, yes, a drone from Iran has been shot down by a missile from a RAF jet. And there's a degree of amusement because, of course, Ukrainians shoot down hundreds of drones on a daily basis and have done for many years, and they don't need to use valuable air-to-air missiles to do that from jets. But it's not the finest hour of the UK's international role at the moment in history, I'm afraid to say. I'm afraid so. I do agree with Donald Trump on that particular point.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, can you ask the next question, please?
Yes, Stuart Kaplan asks, given Trump's stated positions on this war, isn't it likely that he will criticize Western institutions if they make frozen Russian assets available to Ukraine? If so, would he try to punish or sanction those institutions for doing so?
I think from a political point of view, I don't think it is likely, is my sense. I mean, I do find him a difficult person to predict. So you never know, but I would be surprised. I would think that he may see the opportunity if that were to be done, because of course, if Ukraine were to suddenly have access to that amount of money, it would be a potential customer of the United States of America.
Definitely. That would certainly be appreciated by Trump. Tetyana, do you want to reply to that too?
I find it a difficult proposition, because effectively the only reason why any financial institution in Europe would hand over the assets that they hold to a different fund, because it's not going to be handing them over to Ukraine. They're going to be handing them over to another fund based in Europe called compensation fund. But the only basis on which they'd be doing it would be European law. So it won't just happen because that's what they've decided. So Trump will have to say that that European law is illegal and contrary to the public policy of US, such as to warrant sanctions, whereas you in the US already have a law which says that this is precisely what a president is able to do. So I just find that proposition really difficult to follow. I can't imagine on what sort of basis he would impose sanctions. Kind of speaking as a sanctions lawyer, you can't just impose sanctions because you feel like it. I mean, President Trump might do, but under the law, you can't just do it because you feel like it. You have to justify them. And certainly his advisors will be asking him to justify it. So whilst you have a law in America authorizing the president to hand over the funds to Ukraine or to a Ukraine compensation fund, I can't see him ever sanctioning anybody in Europe for doing exactly the same thing.
Okay, thank you. Dovil, do we have another question?
Yes, Jacob asks, Vladimir Putin is now 73, and the Wagner mutiny in 2023 showed that rebellion against Moscow is possible. How is Putin maintaining his grip on power as the war drags on, and what might happen if he can no longer do so?
Well, I mean, that goes to what Tetyana's articulated. Maybe one end game for all of this, which is fragmentation of Russia. Not something to be taken lightly, of course, because that has consequences. But my understanding is he's borrowing against the prospect of the sanctioned assets being returned. And I've been encouraging the UK government to, even if they don't at this stage feel like they're able to give them to Ukraine as compensation, I've been urging them at least to commit that Russia won't get it back until it repays Ukraine. I think one of the collateral effects of allowing the principal on these state assets to be given to Ukraine as compensation may very well be to turn up the thumbscrews on the Russian economy, and it's ultimately the economy that would probably a collapse of the economy is what would lead to the collapse of the state. I think that is the most likely, rather than a march on the Kremlin.
That's precisely right. What we're seeing right now is sort of a weakening of the Russian economy, and that leads instability. We're not going to see the collapse of Russia, I don't think. I don't think Russia will collapse, in terms of fall apart into different states. But what we will see is a collapse of power, possibly because of the collapse of the economy. And there already are, because Russia has been fighting wars for a long time. And so one can see that there's the sort of the secret services who might be vying for power. There's the business interests who'll be vying for power. There'll be the military interests who'll be vying for power. Putin has been in this incredible position of actually uniting within Russia all of those different powers, sort of the oligarchs, the financial people, the secret services, which is where he comes from, and the military. But the moment Putin shows weakness, and he might be showing it now because the war isn't going the way it was planned to go, those three powers might go separate ways and try to push their own successor. And
do you think Putin could end the war, believing it would be to his advantage, by declaring victory, by citing certain successes he has had? Would he get away with that within the Russian political establishment?
He'll probably get away with it, but I'm not sure economically he'll be able to get away with ending the war, because Russian economy has been geared towards war. There's not very much left of it, so I'm not sure that it's actually economically feasible for him to end the war.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a problem we're facing. I don't think he will end it, even if there is some sort of peace treaty. I don't think the war will end.
Would you agree?
I do. Yeah.
Start somewhere else.
Yeah.
Which goes back to the very first question, actually, doesn't it? Because I think if there were a treaty, I don't think it would end on the Ukrainian side. That's the guerrilla warfare point. Would it even end on the Russian side? Because they need the constant churn of military activity to support the war-based economy, essentially.
It's also a nice way to justify why its people, Russia's people, have to suffer, because the arguments within Russia are, look, you're suffering now, but we have to support the front line. And once the front line goes, those arguments will have to go too.
Are you surprised that there's no backlash in Russian society in view of the apparently over 1 million soldiers who have already died? So many of them not from the central areas, but from the often Asian parts of Russia. Are you surprised that there has been no backlash at all? Apparently,
No, I'm not surprised.
No. I'm not. Sorry, after you, Tetyana.
It's just not a society that thinks the way that we Ukrainians and Europeans do. They're not a free society. They haven't been free for a very long time. And those Asian population who are sent to fight in the front line, they don't even realize that they themselves are colonized and occupied by Russia. They don't recognize even that. So how would they recognize anything else? And also they're paid huge amounts of money. This is a problem. People in Russia in those areas live in such poverty that the amount of money that the family gets by sending one of their sons to the front line far outweighs whatever they might feel about losing.
I think there's another thing that communism may be dead, but Russian nationalism and imperialism is very much alive and kicking. And it's endemic. And even some of the, I won't mention names, even some of the high profile opponents of Putin in recent years, when you look at their policy on international policy as opposed to domestic policy, there's not a lot of difference actually in terms of their views of Russia's position in the world. And I used to have a degree of sympathy with the argument the invasion first started, that so many Russians they can't know what's going on because of access to internet and news, etc. I don't think that's right anymore. And there are certain parts of the world where there's a high concentrations of the Russian kind of middle class, not the oligarchs, but the minigarchs, the middle classes. You go on holiday somewhere like Sharm el Sheikh, for example, or until recently, certainly Dubai. Everyone's pretty much Russian, and they will know. If you can afford to get a flight from Moscow to Sharm el Sheikh, you know what's going on. I think there are ways we could turn up the screw. One thing I've been campaigning for in Parliament here, and I still am, is there are a number of airlines that service the European markets, including the very lucrative London Heathrow Airport, which are with its transatlantic connections to your part of the world. A number of airlines that also still serve Moscow and Russia, and allow the Russian middle classes to go to these nice places and sun themselves whilst their country is benefiting from an illegal war. I think that those airlines should be forced to choose. Do you want to fly into the airspace of the EU and the UK, or do you want to service Russia? And they include Emirates, Etihad, names you'll have heard of, Royal Air Morocco, Turkish Airlines, for example. They are but some of the airlines in question, and I think that there should be a ban within EU and UK airspace of those airlines that continue to serve the Russian market, because they are propping up the economy. And if that were to happen, which could be done in a relatively straightforward measure, there are bans on other airlines from other parts of the world, it could be done relatively straightforward. That would firstly turn the thumbscrews on the Russian economy, and secondly, put a bit more pressure on the Russian people, certainly the people who have got the finances and the means to actually do something about the current administration in Russia. If they suddenly find they can't go on holiday to Dubai, they can't go and have their turkey teeth done, they can't go to Sharm el Sheikh, so I'm very keen that that's done.
Thank you. At the moment, they don't want to go to Dubai anyway, I would say.
No, not for now.
Dovil, can we have another question?
An audience member asks, with rising energy costs and what some describe as energy fatigue across Europe, how are individual European countries adjusting their aid packages to Ukraine in light of these new energy and financial pressures?
Good question, yeah.
Good question. I think it's probably premature to answer that question, because the events in Iran and the consequent effect on energy prices is obviously very recent. And it's not yet totally clear whether the effect on oil prices is going to be short term or longer term. because obviously that depends to some degree on what's happening right now in Iran, in the Straits of Hormuz, etc. Um, Clearly, if the situation doesn't improve in relation to oil energy prices, there's going to come a point where there is going to be effect on cost of living, and I see that will there be a mood amongst politicians and the public that, oh well, that means we need to sort of stop spending money on Ukraine. I don't think so. I doubt it. I mean, if anything, it might rather demonstrate that we ought to have been doing more about Russia previously, because it goes back to the overall issue of energy security. I mean, you can go back and find articles in the London Times, for example, from the 2000s, but under the Brown administration, under the early David Cameron administration, saying we need to make the UK energy secure now because otherwise we'd hock to Putin, and we never did. We never got around to it. So I think, if anything, that's probably going to be the political mood is a move, as Tetyana said, towards more renewables, towards more nuclear power stations, a move to streamline the planning and regulatory processes for those kinds of energy generating stations in order to ensure that we don't get caught up as victims of oil prices rises in future.
And that's very much what we have seen in Europe already. There's been a lot of funding offered by the European Central Bank for renewable energy projects. So I think we will see more and more of that.
There's a rumor that tomorrow there's going to be a big announcement in the UK about deregulating nuclear power. So that's maybe one early incident of this.
Thank you. We will look out for that. One of our loyal followers, Brian Keelev of Chapel Hill, he asked the question, what about Mr. Farage? What is his attitude towards Russia and the Ukraine war? Is it similar to Viktor Orban's in Hungary? How does he position himself?
Wow.
Also, let me ask and add to that, will Mr. Farage be the future Prime Minister of the UK? What do you think, Charlie?
Very good question. Both of them are good. So on foreign policy, well, the very is it's very hard to know what Mr. Farage and his fellow reform politicians think about Russia and Ukraine, because they are studiously silent on foreign policy in Parliament. They have almost without exception not participated in any of the debates on foreign policy and defence since the last election. Definitely silent. I don't think they've got a defence spokesman. They've got various spokesmen, all sorts of other things, but not so. So who knows? It's clearly not something that they want to talk about. Well, one does then wonder, well, why is that? Is it because they haven't thought it through? Is it because they have Russian sympathies? I mean, you may be aware that the previous, a very prominent member of the Reform Party in Wales, has been jailed for 14 years, which in our country is a long time to be jailed. We don't have quite the same penal sentencing that you have in America. 14 years for taking bribes from Russia in the connection with his political activities. Is Russian interference in Western politics, does it extend more systemically in reform? I think that's a very interesting question. One that I would like to see Nigel Farage address in a candid way. Will he be PM? He might be. I mean, he's head of the polls. At least there was a poll today where they've gone. The lead's gone down to 4%. Actually, they're on 22%. The Conservatives now on 19%. We have a very strange, but not very arcane voting system, the first past the post and the constituency system in the UK, and it's only really designed to work for a two-party country. And at the moment now, our politics is very fragmented. So Labour got a majority of over 200 seats with a vote share of, I think it was 30 something percent. So you get wildly disproportionate outcomes. And at the moment, we've got Reform leading. We've got the Greens doing better than they've ever done before. We've got the Lib Dems doing about as well as they've ever done before, and the Tories and Labour doing as badly as they've ever done before. So that proliferation of everybody being on between about 16 and 22%, as opposed to two parties on 40 and 30%. That means it's very, very hard to predict what the outcome of the election will be, because there will be all these local microclimates in individual and things do. So that's a very long way of not answering your question, like a politician. He might be. I almost wonder. I'm not a fan of Nigel Farage. You might have picked up. If it weren't for the damage I think it would do to the country's reputation and economy, um, one's almost tempted to give him a go because I think he'll screw it up, and then people stop. That people will realise the grass isn't greener on the other side, and that will permanently exterminate reform and their reputation going forward. But the damage would be very substantial, I think, to my country and its reputation and its people. And so I hope that in the years to come between now and the next election, he will be defeated through persuasion.
Thank you. Let me follow up, though, that is slightly digressing from our main topic today. Will there be a new leader of the Labour Party and a new leader of the Conservative Party pretty soon?
I'm going to have to duck the second one as somebody who takes the Conservative whip in Parliament. Other than I suspect Kemi Badenoch's position is pretty safe now that Robert Jenrick has left for reform. Will there be a new leader of the Labour Party? I think almost certainly. There will be during the course of this year. I don't think it's likely to be before May because there are local elections and no potential new leader wants to be as one of the first things they do to have to defend Labour's record at local elections, then take the hit for what I suspect will be a catastrophic midterm local election result for them. So I think there's a strong desire to keep Starmer going till May. It's quite hard to replace the leader of the Labour Party under their constitution, but I think it's very likely that that will happen because I think he's got to the point where it's untenable. All the stuff coming out literally right now about what he was told about Peter Mandelson before appointing him to be the ambassador to the USA and what he knew about Peter Mandelson's ongoing links with Jeffrey Epstein, I think that may very well end up being the final nail in the coffin.
Okay, thank you. I know you will soon have to rush, but maybe you allow me to ask a couple of more questions because we have plenty of questions. Andrew, would you ask another one, please?
Yes. Stuart Kaplan asks, would putting more European forces into Baltic nations serve to put more pressure on Russia?
How do you see that, Tetyana?
Look, I think we're putting more force into Baltic nations because we feel that they're in danger. As I said, I don't think the analytics that we're hearing is that Russia is producing so much war machinery that it's far more exceeds what it needs in Ukraine. And the only plausible reason for that is that it intends to go to war somewhere else. And I think the Baltics are really worried that it will want to extend its ambitions to the former Soviet Union states, who are now part of the EU and NATO.
Can I ask you, we usually hear if Ukraine falls, which we all don't want to hear and want to hope, of course, but let's say there is some sort of victory by Putin, then he would continue further into Georgia, into Moldova, into the Baltic states, even Poland. Can we be sure of that? Why would he? Because Ukraine has always taken a special place in Russian history, whether we accept it or not. But that is, I think, the perception of Putin. Would he necessarily go further into NATO territory or non-NATO?
I think I'd say, why wouldn't he? I mean, yes, Ukraine has always been special, and that may be partly why it was first, but I don't think it'll be the last.
But it wasn't first.
Well, it wasn't first because Georgia was first.
Exactly.
Well, right, exactly. Well, Georgia was easier. But no, I think the answer is why wouldn't he? When I go back to what I was saying earlier about Russian imperialism, Russian nationalism being alive and kicking, their view of so those who subscribe to that view, their view of Russia's position in the world is not Russia plus Georgia and Ukraine bolted on. It's a lot more than that, and they fundamentally, they want to disprove the concept of Article 5 of NATO. Fundamentally, it would be and so I think what would follow after Ukraine, or maybe even in parallel from Ukraine, or maybe even in the interregnum, if there is a peace, a temporary peace, which I think would only be temporary, would be some kind of low-level activity on a NATO member state to test and then ratchet it up, test Article 5 in the hope of disproving Article 5, which I think is really the ultimate dream for Putin.
Tetyana, any thoughts on that?
I agree. I mean, I think Moldova is definitely in danger, and we know that he has been there's a frozen conflict there, the Prидnestrovье, which is held by the sort of the so-called Russian forces. So Moldova is definitely in danger, and I think the Baltic states as well, because they have a border with Russia, and it will just be tempting for them to try it. So I don't think Russia will necessarily want to stop. And as I said, it makes sense for Russia to carry on the war. And in Putin's mind, the only way he can leave a mark on history is by extending Russia. And whether it's through actually getting territory or through extending his influence and power, it could be done in different ways. But we know that Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia will not allow Russian power. And so, just like Ukraine did not allow Russian power, we have expelled our pro-Russian president. And so the only way then to control those nations would be by going in militarily.
Thank you. Let me digress again, if I may, because that question came from Don van Atta. He just said, the House of Lords has just voted to drop the last hereditary peer from the House of Lords. As a peer, do you have any thoughts about this change? Should the House of Lords, and that is what I'm adding, should the House of Lords really be abolished?
Should it be? It can't be, but I must say, I used to think before I joined it, perhaps I would say it, wouldn't I now? I used to think that was a stronger argument, abolishing the House of Lords, than having it wholly elected. Because it was wholly elected, you have a rival chamber, you have all sorts of issues with gridlock, which obviously America has had experience with, and also I just don't think you get a very high quality. You get a lot of jumped up county councillors, and we've kind of got enough elected politicians. There needs to be a second chamber. There's too much work. That's what I've really realised once I've joined, is the process of scrutinising, improving legislation, the process of select committees exploring particularly important issues, debates on those, etc., can't be done by one house. There's simply not enough hours in the day and not enough members of parliament. So there needs to be a second house. So it can't be abolished in practice. So the only question then is, well, what about the composition of it? I must say the hereditary peers legislation I got. There were some lovely, lovely people who are hereditary peers. There were some wonderful colleagues who've served the country very well indeed, and whose families have served the country well indeed in the past. I had some difficulty, if I'm quite honest, as a constitutional lawyer ultimately at heart. I had some difficulty with the notion that you could have a right by birth to a legislative position. I think that's a difficult sell in a modern democracy, if I'm quite honest with you. So, though it's the end of an era that the hereditaries are no longer going to have their right by birth to sit in the House of Lords, or the 92 remaining ones, I think the time probably had come. There's been a deal whereby 15 of them in the Conservative Party, and they're largely so 15 will get life peerages, so we'll be able to carry on as individuals, which I think is a good compromise, because there are some very good people there who've got a lot of experience. But I think it was probably the right decision. I don't support an elected house. Again, perhaps I would say it, wouldn't I, as a member, an appointed member, for the reasons I've given. I have some issue with the bishops being in the House of Lords, certainly without there being any representation from other religions. So that, the Catholic Church, Islam, the Sikh community, the Jewish community in particular, who, there needs to be they're well represented in number in the House of Lords, but Israel has come under an awful lot of negative. Narrative commentary, and I think it's important to have a rabbi in there, etc. So I think there's things that could be done around the edges with Lord's reform, but largely I would stick with it being an appointed house, but one which ultimately was a reviewing and scrutinising chamber rather than the primary chamber.
Thank you. But if there's so much work to be done and you're a full-time lawyer above all, how can you be active in the House of Lords? Like
Yes.
10% or 20%? Or how do you
It's why I've got the bags under my eyes, Klaus. That's why is I don't sleep. The way I do, different people do it in different ways. So the way I do it is, as I've gone in mid-career, as a expert as opposed to end of career as a politician who's no longer elected and has sort of seen it all, done it all, is I stick to my areas of expertise. So in my day job as a planning and infrastructure lawyer, in relation to foreign policy, defence and Ukraine matters, which obviously is, as per today, is something I've got a personal interest in, expertise in, and then also in relation to legal issues. So I tend to go in specifically on what I call my mastermind subjects, my specialty subjects. I might have an opinion about tax, I might have an opinion about healthcare, but they're not what I was put into the legislature for. So I tend to leave the debates about those subjects to those who are the experts in them.
Okay, thank you. Two more questions and then we'll have to say goodbye. And maybe a question for Tetyana from Andrew. Do we have a question?
One question was, has not the US historically opposed tapping an adversary's assets held by Western institutions as a way of offsetting the costs of opposing those adversaries? If so, what are the chances the US will alter its position with regard to the Ukraine-Russian war?
I have to say I'm not familiar with that position by US. Certainly, when it came to the war with Kuwait, Iraq and Kuwait, they were not opposed to seizing Iraq's central bank assets. So I don't know. I'm not sure they will necessarily be opposing. I think it's going to be a political question. And not just a question of what US have done in the past, but a political question for the current president. And I think he will do whatever he feels is in the best interest of America.
Thank you. Dovil, do we have another final question?
Stuart asks whether Putin might use little green men in Latvia or Estonia to test NATO's Article 5, given their sizable Russian-speaking populations.
I think he may very well do. Yes, I think that is a really strong prospect. If I mean Article 5, people associate Article 5 with nuclear war, but it's a proportionate response. You can trigger Article 5 and have a NATO response that is proportionate, commensurate to the activity. You cut our cables, we'll cut yours, for example. It doesn't have to be nuclear war, and we need to be a little bit I think less intimidated by the shadow of the mushroom cloud when it comes to these kinds of decisions, should that happen, which I say I think it's pretty likely that they will happen.
Thank you. Any thoughts on that, Tetyana?
Look, I think it could Russian-speaking population could be used as a pretext, like it was used in Ukraine. But I think they're doing everything they can to make sure that they don't have or they don't announce that they have any Russian-speaking population left. And I think that's what we should have done in Ukraine. I mean, our problem was that we decided to do a very gentle transition from the Russian language, which we were forced to speak. In my city, I'm from Donetsk, which is a million-strong city. It was one of the million-strong cities. We only had one Ukrainian school, and that Ukrainian school was opened in 1996. So, there was absolutely no chance for me to study in Ukrainian. Even though Ukrainian was my first language, I had to study in Russian. And we went with a very gentle politics. Now everything's changed. Everything is in Ukrainian. But I think Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have done it much earlier than we have in Ukraine. But it could be used as a pretext. I agree.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. When you look into the future, and that is a little bit speculation, but when you look into the future, look at Russia's frozen assets, our main topic today, and also the future of the Ukraine war, the future of Ukrainian connection with the Western world. Where do you think will we be in, let's say, 12 months' time from now?
I hope in 12 months' time we will have some further acknowledgements of the wrongs that were done by Russia. We will be further on the establishment of the International Tribunal for the Crime of Aggression. We will have the Claims Commission established, and we will be talking about the establishment of compensation fund to make sure that people who have suffered as a result of the war will actually be paid. And I really hope that we will be looking towards Ukraine's victory and thinking about reconstruction at that stage.
So in 12 months' time, the war will more or less be finished?
Look, I don't want to predict, but I think it's gone on for a really long time. I think 5 years is probably enough, don't you?
I fully agree. Charlie, what is your view? And what about the Iran war? Will that still be ongoing?
I don't know. I'm an optimist by character. I have quite a gloomy outlook, actually, on all of this, I must be said. I think that within about a year to 18 months, might be 18 months, I think there will be some direct confrontation between Russia and NATO.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think that's my sense of where
I'm sorry, I wanted to finish, but now I have to ask you,
Yes.
why do you think so? You need to explain that, because that would lead us to another war.
Potentially. Sherlock Holmes used to say, I don't know if this is a saying in America, once you eliminate the impossible, whatever's left, however improbable, is the likely answer. It was quite a famous saying of Sherlock Holmes. And as I say, once you eliminate the things that I think are either impossible or extremely unlikely to happen, such as Russia giving up its claim to Ukraine or Ukraine giving up its claim to its own land, once you realize that Russia isn't going to stop there, once you factor in Taiwan and China, once you factor in Iran, etc., where does this all end? And I don't think it's necessarily going to end very well.
Well, thank you very much for this
Sorry.
concluding note. I normally like to end on a more optimistic note, but I guess
you should have asked me last.
Yes.
So, Tetyana, have you got something more optimistic to say?
Look, I can only be optimistic about my country. I think the spring is here, and we're looking forward to some more decisions on accountability. So, but I think the message that I will have from Ukrainian is that you have to enjoy every day. You don't know what's going to come next. We might well be looking at the beginning of World War III. In fact, we Ukrainians said that the start of the war in Ukraine was the beginning of World War III. But we still have to live our lives. So let's enjoy the spring.
Well, thank you very much. Lord Charlie Banner, Tetyana, Nesterchuk, it has been a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you for your insights, for the stimulating conversation, for answering all our many questions. Thank you to Dovil and Andrew for assisting us. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us to the bitter end. And it was a stimulating session. I thank you for that. We will have more Krasno events coming up in April. But for the time being, thank you again to our two distinguished guests.
Thank you.
Good night for now. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you so much. See you soon, hopefully in person before long. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.